Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
This year, I invite you to look at the Megillah through two different lenses. The lens of nationalism, a sense of national consciousness that exalts one country, one nation above all others, versus cosmopolitanism, which derives from the Greek for citizen of the world, a sense that we are all part of a single human community. Politics in this country has veered between the poles of right wing and left wing, conservative versus liberal. I'd like to actually frame it as slightly differently and see the Megillah as part of this political conversation. How does nationalism and how does cosmopolitanism come into encounter these forces, encounter each other in the context of the Megillah? So on one level, we begin our Megillah with a party where at some degree, this 187 days of binge drinking represents Achashverosh's aim of unifying everyone, of everyone coming together to celebrate his security, his third year on the throne. And yet Achashverosh bounces between these forces because he invites everyone to partake and enjoy and celebrate together. And later, when he sends out his missive, he'll send that missive out in every possible language, which of course creates confusion and slows the process of communication and acknowledges that each person is part of not this larger more global entity of an empire, but part of a nation. This will come to a hilt in Esther 3:8, when Haman says that there is a nation, Am Mufuradu Mufuzar, a scattered nation among the king's empire that does not behave the way that other polities does, and they don't observe the king's laws. Again, this tension between whether or not Achashverosh intends to create one empire or an expansive sense of small units that are only joined together very tenuously. I'd like to suggest that the 10th perek, the shortest chapter of the Megillah by far, presents us with an opportunity to think about how these forces of cosmopolitanism and nationalism align, and think a little bit about the ending of the Megillah, of the book, that we don't actually have written. So let's go to chapter 10 together. King Achashverosh imposed taxes on his on the country, on the land, and all of the islands. Now, this is a little bit geographically surprising for us because we've encountered Shushan. We've talked about the 127 different nations that are united in Achashverosh's empire, or at least coexist in Achashverosh's empire, but there's been no mention of islands. So we'll keep that as a little question. Then we go to verse 2 of chapter 10. V'chol ma'aseh takvo gvurato u'farsha gedulat Mordechai asher gidlu hamelech halo hem ketuvim al sefer divrei yamim l'malchei madai ufaras. Now, I'm going to read the way that it's translated by JPS and also question that translation. All his mighty and powerful acts and a full account of his greatness, to which the king advanced Mordechai, are recorded in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. One senses here that Mordechai's greatness is magnified and amplified by the fact that it's included in these foreign annals. Who would have thought at the beginning of this story that Mordechai, who was lurking in the shadows of the king's castle, trying to get word to Esther, would suddenly become second to the king, and he would become part of, if you like, forever part of the annals of history. And yet there's a word here that's very striking. Halohim, aren't they written? Almost as if someone were trying to show how important the Jew was in this empire. Aren't they written? Didn't you hear about this news? How do we communicate to someone? There's an element of surprise. And let's go to the third verse. Ki Mordechai Yudi Mishneh LaMelech because Mordechai, the Jew, was the second to the king. V'gadol liyudim v'ratzui l'rov achav, doresh tov le'amo, v'dover shalom l'chol zaro. He was great. V'gadol liyudim, he was great in the eyes of the Jews, and he was popular, as the translation, with the multitude of his brethren. Many of us are familiar with the commentary. Rov achav v'lo chol achav, and he was popular with many or most, but not with all, because of course, when you're in his position, you're going to compromise in some way the desires of your particular nation for the sake of good governance. And we conclude on this tension that Mordechai has to navigate. Doresh tov le'amo, he seeks good for his own people, but dover shalom l'chol zaro, and he seeks peace. He speaks peace l'chol zaro, to all. Now, to all, zero could be his specific seed, right? Those that came after him, or those that came from him, or one could look at it as, again, the citizen of the world, that in some way he's connected to all humankind in the position that he has. So as we review the strangeness of these three verses, seemingly disconnected, they to me point to the tension that Mordechai has to navigate in his position. On the one hand, I think as a result of Mordechai's reimposition of taxes and his desire to make Achashverosh more fiscally responsible, he actually extends the king's power in terms of giving tribute to everywhere, not only the land, but also the margins, the very islands that perhaps were left out in the king's original thinking. So Mordechai is trying to perhaps create a cosmopolitan flavor for the empire through the arm of taxation. But then we have the next sort of amplification of cosmopolitanism, with Mordechai being written in these records, that Mordechai didn't only speak to his people, he did not only contribute to their success, he contributed to the success of the empire at large. And we conclude with Mordechai and not Esther, in some ways suggesting that Mordechai was able to walk this tightrope, and that he was able to act in ways that augmented his nation while also contributing to a larger entity, to being a citizen of the empire. This, however, is where our story ends and where our imaginations begin. We now have to think about how exactly did Mordechai live out his days in the empire? How did these two forces, which are not well aligned with each other and are bound to come into conflict, how did these forces play out? So I want to share with you something that I did which was very informative and instrumental for me in the conclusion of my book on Esther, my commentary on Esther, Power, Fate, and Fragility in Exile. I created three alternative endings that I believe all are sourced in other stories in Tanakh and feel authentic to me. And I wouldn't be surprised if some variation of them had appeared to continue our chapter. The first is, after Mordechai increased taxation, the people grumbled against the Jews, and the enmity they had in the days of Haman was renewed. At this time, Hatach was elevated to chief steward of the royal house. He suggested that the king celebrate his renewed coffers with another royal feast. Thus, the king invited all of his officers and all his satrapies to come to Shushan for a 7-day banquet, and a proclamation was written and delivered throughout the empire in the language of each and every nation that all were to drink without limit. After Achashverosh was full with wine, he asked for his wife Esther to be brought to his chambers before his nobles to display her beauty. So in that ending, we find a cycle of events that once Achashverosh once again feels secure on his throne, that he repeats the behavior, and we could certainly imagine him doing so, and then asks Esther to come into his chamber. Again, pitting his sort of immediate temporal desires with the welfare of his larger family and the welfare of the empire. So that's possible ending number 1. So if you're Dora the Explorer and going with me on our next adventure, where you pick the ending, here's ending number 2. Esther and Achashverosh had a child, and the child's name was Darius. Esther went into the king unsummoned, and the king laid forth his scepter and said, "What is your wish, Queen Esther?" "Up to half of the kingdom, and it shall be given to you." And Esther said, "My plea and my request, if I found favor in your eyes, is that Darius inherit the throne in the fullness of days." And the king was filled with rage. "The son of Vashti is the firstborn heir. It is to him that I bequeath the kingdom." Now, this, of course, reminds us of Bathsheba, when Bathsheba appeals to King David to have Solomon inherit the throne, where there are other contenders, and those contenders and that competition is fierce and devastating. But it also documents in this story that Esther's presence on the throne will be relatively short-lived. There'll be one generation. The next generation will simply go back to the way that it was. And our third imaginative ending is, and it was recorded in the annals of Persia and Media, that Achashverosh was old, and he was gathered unto his ancestors, and his son took the royal throne. This son was not like his father, and did evil in God's eyes. Thus a new king had risen over 127 provinces, who did not know Mordechai and Esther. The Jews of Shushan had grown numerous as the stars in the sky and the dust of the land. The king said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are too numerous for us. Let us deal wisely with them, so that they do not increase, lest in a time of war they join forces against us and rise up from the ground." And of course, this ending is a reflection of an earlier story, the story that Esther's often compared to, and that is the story of Joseph's meteoric rise, and then Vayakam Melech Chadash, then a new king rises who did not know Joseph. And as a result, the Jews are objects of suspicion. Their increase in reproductivity is seen as a threat rather than a contribution to the empire. So it was fun to write 3 endings, and I invite you to sit down and write your own ending this Purim for this book and how you imagine it may have ended. I actually think that perhaps the editors of the Megillah left it only 3 verses to ask us to think about nationalism versus cosmopolitanism. Are Jews citizens of their own nation or citizens of the world? And when they're negotiating those 2 identities, do they come together seamlessly, or do they fight continuously within them and within, not only within the person, but within the nation and the perception of self and others, the collective, versus this desire to become somewhat harmonious with one's environment rather than stand out? The fact is that in any of these scenarios, the Jew in the diaspora must make certain compromises that can eat at the heart of what Jewish identity is. And perhaps, if I may be so bold, sitting in the diaspora to say this, that the book of Esther really ends with a happy ending, but it's an ending that's incomplete, that suggests that there are other chapters, that even the brief glimpse at power and significance is soon eclipsed by other forces far greater, and the cycles of history continue. That question as to whether or not the book of Esther is a story of success in the diaspora or a story of temporal success in the diaspora is one that I leave you to answer.